Hello, my name is Buddy Childress, and I'm Executive Director of Needles Eye Ministries. We are really happy to have you with us today for our monthly speaker series. We hope you enjoy it. I have known David Barrett since 1978. I did not know him when he went to the University of Maryland, but you're going to hear a little bit about that in a moment. He is a graduate of the University of Maryland. David sort of epitomizes what Webster's talks about when it talks about entrepreneurship. He began with a large corporation, DePuy, and he became their largest distributor after several years and had his own shop here called DePuy Barrett. They sold prosthetics and orthotic devices, and he actually was the leading distributor worldwide. He was so good at that, and he wouldn't tell you this, but they actually bought him and moved him to the metropolis of the Midwest, Warsaw, Indiana, where he was vice president of sales for Johnson & Johnson, the parent company. After a number of years, David, not too many, he got a little tired of that and came back to Richmond to begin what he now does as president and CEO of Barrett Capital Management. Actually started that company, which is a wealth management company, about a year and a half before the market went south. Is that about right? Yeah, which probably wasn't the best time to do it, but at the time, who knew, right? But he's still been very successful in his doing good work for his clients in that context. David has been on many boards around Richmond, not, in my opinion, not the least of which would be boards like the Family Foundation. He's been at Fork Union and also on the Needles Eye Board on 2 occasions, and actually served as our chair for 1 whole month before he moved to Warsaw. He and his wife, Kay, have 5 children. Kay is here. Where are you, Kay? There she is right there. Definitely his better half. And I would say the same about Laura for me as well. And if I didn't, David would. Help me welcome my good friend and our speaker today, David Barrett.
Well, thank you, buddy, for that nice introduction. And I'm going to separate my talk into like 3 sections today. My first section is going to be my life before God or before Christ. The second section is going to be how I met Christ, or how he finally introduced himself to me and I listened. And then my life after having had that experience. So my story is kind of colorful. It all started September 16, 1949 in San Diego when I was born. My parents were Jim and Betty, and they really described colorful. Real brief, my dad was a raging conservative and a Republican all of his life. He played football for Notre Dame in the late 1930s, so that was kind of neat to grow up with a Notre Dame dad. He was a career FBI agent, and my mother was one of the most liberal people I've ever met in my entire life. I have no idea what they were thinking about. But by the time I was 3 years old, my dad had been transferred to Baltimore, and I grew up in a neighborhood that Tom Gallagher might know something about, but it was a Roman Catholic Irish neighborhood, and it was row houses in the Baltimore area, and it was really a lot of fun to grow up in a neighborhood like that. You had all the Irish names in the background, and you know, the Gahagans and the Murphys and the Kellys, and we just ran all day long, and that's how I grew up. I walked a block to elementary school, and I walked 6 blocks to high school. So my entire world was Baltimore City and little small red brick row homes. It was kind of white collar, but mostly blue collar, and it was a lot of fun. But you know, neighborhoods like that are known for the fun, but there was a lot of tragedy and hardship in those types of neighborhoods as well. To say the least, there was a lot of alcoholism and substance abuse, just a lot of difficult things that occurred. I can remember as a child listening through one of the walls in the row home to a lot of what seemed to be like violence and knocking and banging and screaming. And later on that family moved, only we found out that this guy was an alcoholic, and he came home, and if his dinner wasn't on the table, he beat his wife, and the kids were always bruised up and had black eyes, and anyway, he was eventually dealt with. But so those types of neighborhoods do have tragedy as well. And at home, I had kind of a double life, because outside the house, and I ran and had so much fun. The kind of neighborhood where you either learn how to fight or you learn how to run very fast. And since I really couldn't do either well, I surrounded myself with bigger and braver people that became my best friends or worst friends, depending upon how you looked at it. And at home, when the doors were shut, this very liberal mom and this very Republican dad fought a lot and drank way too much. And so I kind of grew up in that environment. 12 years old, I had gravitated completely to the wrong kind of crowd. And in particular, there were two guys that I always remember fondly for some reason, Teddy and Richard. And these were probably the two toughest guys in the 7th grade. And they wore black leather jackets. I always thought that was so cool. I either couldn't afford one or wasn't allowed to have one, but I just really thought that this was, you know, the end of the end. And anyway, Richard, on the night before the last dance in the 7th grade, before you graduate up to the 8th grade, had somehow or another purchased and or stolen 12 little country club malt liquors. And they're 7-ounce cans, and so I chipped in and I got 4 of the little 7-ounce cans at age 12, and we crouched down behind some cars in the parking lot. I remember it like it was yesterday, and consumed those 4 little cans of country club malt liquor so fast that I just don't think you could take fluid down any faster. And by the time we got up, my whole world had changed. The drug alcohol, the first time I really ever experienced it at that level, was something that was spectacular for me. As a matter of fact, I went into that dance, and I've said this many times, that evening I got taller, and I was definitely a better dancer than I'd ever been before, and really much more popular and tougher. And, you know, I just, everything, it all came together. And for about 14 more years, I worked very hard to kind of relive that moment, to find all of that security in that drug alcohol. By the time I was 15 and living in the battle zone at home, I showed my parents who was really in charge. And I left home way before it was popular to be a runaway kid. And I left for about 2.5 months when I was 15 years old and hitchhiked around, worked up and got as far away as southern Ontario, Canada. And probably those 60 or 70 days I was gone, I was probably, at least I drank every day and probably was extremely drunk about 90% of the time. By 17, graduating from college, came home. My parents were still together. They didn't divorce until I was 19. So the battle just went on, and I went off to University of Maryland with this, as I described it, as my background. And if you can just imagine getting ready for the perfect storm, because I went to school in 1967 that fall, and that was the summer of love. Now, that was the way the media put it, but it was just an introduction of a sinful lifestyle that came into college campuses, and I was ready and raring to join. It was truly a perfect storm in my life and just completely ready for a somewhat addictive personality. So 1967, 68, 69, the words that come to mind that describe my life were rock and roll. I didn't play an instrument, but I certainly followed every band that I could. Drugs, alcohol, and immorality. Now, those are the things that the press liked to talk about, but the things that related to me and translated to my life were things like declining health, mentally and physically, and of course spiritually, broken relationships, and something that I don't talk about a lot, but what started to creep into this drug-addicted life was crippling depression and anxiety. And it was a life of some suffering that could only be medicated by mind-altering drugs. Oh, and let's not forget the somewhat famous car accidents of Baltimore County, Baltimore City, and around College Park, Maryland. I worked hard. I finally, Vietnam helped me to stay focused because I didn't want to get drafted, even though I was 1A for about 18 months. And I got 207 in the lottery, for those that remember the lottery, so that kept me out of the draft. And that helped me to graduate from college with a Bachelor in Science and a lot of dependencies on all of the wrong things. By the time I graduated from college at age 21, I was an absolute and total slave to mind-altering drugs and especially alcohol. You know, like Teddy and Richard, I continued to hang around with all of the wrong people. You know, as I've told my kids, you know, make sure that your friends are really your friends, and these were not really good friends. They always kind of encouraged me to do all the wrong things. I had become a slave to a sinful lifestyle that I had subjected myself. And a lot of it had to do with the friends that I was picking. As a matter of fact, I don't like to talk about this because it's very hurtful, but the two best friends that I had in college, a young guy named Rod and a fellow named Joe from Baltimore, one of the smartest guys I ever met, they were all wrapped up in the same things I was. I went with this twosome. It became a threesome, and we would take 2 different semester breaks in Florida. And I tell you, I could write a book just on those trips, sleeping on the beach in Daytona, almost getting eaten by an alligator or whatever they have down in the swamps, and on and on and on, things that happen to people. But that's the funny part. The sad part is both Joe and Rod were dead within 12 months of graduation. Joe got extremely interested in LSD, and so he either jumped out or fell out or flew out of an 8-story window in Hagerstown Hall at University of Maryland. And Rod, the summer of our graduation, died of an overdose of heroin up in New York City with some cousins of his. So I feel like many times when I think back to that, first of all, I missed a great deal, and I'm very grateful for that. I missed the opportunity. No one ever offered me anything in a syringe, and cocaine wasn't available. So even though I was in really bad shape, it's not as much as what's offered today. By the time I was graduating from college, I think what you'd call me in the medical world is I became a very functioning alcoholic. Matter of fact, for a while I even sold beer with a big organization, and then I got into the healthcare business. And I did well at all my jobs. Unfortunately for me, the depression and the anxiety continued to grow and grow and grow, and I constantly had to medicate myself. Eventually, I did have to go see a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a medical doctor, and they all recommended tranquilizers. So by the time I was 26 years old, I was very dual addicted. You can buy Librium and Valium and everything on black market, and I found out how to do that because you get it from the same people that you can buy marijuana. And so on April 25th, 1976, let's just call it one of the biggest miracles of my life, is a friend or a father of a friend of mine who had an interest in me and told me that he'd been kind of watching me from afar for a long time. And after a brief conversation one night on April 25th, 1976, he walked me into a church basement on Charles Street in Baltimore, and it was the introduction to a recovery program. Now, they are anonymous, so we'll just leave it anonymous. But I think you all probably know what I'm talking about. And that night, oh, and by the way, since that night, April 25th, 1976, to this moment, I've not had to take a drink or a mind-altering drug. You can applaud. So how does that happen? How can God do something like that? And that's where the credit is given. I heard some prayers that night. It was the first time that I ever heard the Lord's Prayer. Now think about it. I grew up as a Roman Catholic. We used to have to say the Lord's Prayer as penance, along with 1,000 Hail Marys. So I certainly said it a number of times, but I heard the Lord's Prayer for the first time in my life, and it was in a group of 50 people standing in a circle at the end of the meeting. And then the very last thing they did is they prayed a prayer I'd never heard before. And the prayer goes like this, and I'm sure you have heard this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I really heard the words that night for some reason. You know, I was still, that morning I'd taken tranquilizers, so, but that was the meeting that changed everything. I got to tell you something. That was a prayer that changed my life forever because of the anxiety issues, the depression issues, and frankly, I was probably not far away from suicidal thinking because I couldn't live the way I was living, which is why I ended up in that basement of that church. So that was kind of life before Christ. But I didn't really know Jesus at this point. All I heard about at the recovery meetings was some sort of nebulous higher power that I was supposed to turn my life over to. And as a Roman Catholic, for some reason, I'd never met anything like a personal relationship with Christ. And so there was some floundering years. This was age 26, or floundering months at least. I decided, though, however, unlike Richard and Teddy, who introduced me to alcohol, and Rod and Joe that helped fire up the storms of drugs and alcohol, and then they passed away, I started having the opportunity to hang around with people that could be true friends and really help me. I'd learned how from these true friends that if I didn't drink and came back to meetings that I could get better. I could work the program, and the program would work for me. I started to hang around what I would call as high-quality addicts. The first two sponsors, or mentors, that we call them sponsors in the program for me, were two men I met within the first 2 or 3 days of sobriety, or the beginning of sobriety. One gentleman was just a guy that looked like a male model and went on to get married and have 2 or 3 kids. And he graduated from Cornell, got his master's from Cornell, and ended up sleeping under bridges in Philadelphia as a wino. That in itself was kind of impressive, but what was even more impressive at the time, he was an assistant administrator at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and I was selling medical products. And then I met this guy that has one of the most Irish last names you can possibly imagine. He'd been sober in the program for a number of years, had a beautiful wife, 5 great kids. They took a real interest in me. He went on to become a big political figure up in Maryland and a tremendous, very wealthy businessman. So these are the kind of people I started hanging around with, not the others. And I learned about things like take life one day at a time. And then later on found out, if you think about it, in that Lord's Prayer, I heard that for the first time. Give us this day our daily bread. Just give us enough for that one day. A whole new, wonderful concept of life. And that if I could find some gratitude in my life, that it would affect my attitude. And I had so much to be grateful for, I think you would admit. I'm on the way to recovery, but I felt like so much was still missing in my life. I took an opportunity to get what we call around the program a geographical tour. I mean, I'd kind of had enough of Baltimore. I had no, other than people in the program, I really just didn't have many connections. And I had a job promotion, and I moved out to Milwaukee. And as soon as I moved out to Milwaukee, of course, the people in Baltimore were very concerned, and they connected me with people in the program in Milwaukee. And on the first or second day I was out there, I met a guy named, it has to be anonymous, Jim G. Jim G was some kind of living legend. I think he actually knew Bill W. and Dr. Bob, and he'd been in the program for decades and decades, and he was an older gentleman, but a really great guy. And he took a liking to me, and he became my sponsor or my mentor in the Milwaukee area. He would talk to me about the spiritual part, or the spiritual side of the program. Later on, I did find out that he was a Christian, but at the time, he was very smart. He didn't want to chase me away, and he wanted me to continue to look and search for God. He talked about the higher power probably more than any other person I ever met. And one day, when I was probably in a whiny sort of lonely mood, because I moved out to Milwaukee and really didn't know anybody, and I was kind of a curmudgeon of sorts, because I just thought, well, how could all this be happening to me? I'm 27 years old, and, this really shouldn't be my take in life. And the anxiety was still there, and the tremors were still continuing on from the initial days of sobriety. And so it was really kind of an unpleasant time. And I'm sure I was complaining to Jim one night. And Jim said, we're going to talk a lot about this, and we're going to meet. And so we had dinner before a meeting one night, and he brought me a present, and I brought it to show you today. What he wanted to tell me was, and let me do it this way. I'll read what he put on the back, and then I'll show you what the plaque says. Because this plaque is really kind of worn out now, because it's never been away from me since that night. It's always hung next to a desk, usually in my home. And it said right on the back, it's written in cursive, in his penmanship. He has since passed away, the famous Jim G. from Milwaukee. We may have heard of him. He says, "Some people grumble because the roses have thorns. We should be grateful that the thorns have roses." And, different way to look at something. And on the front of the plaque it says, "We have not been deprived, we have been freed." And I think this plaque and those thoughts changed the way I started thinking about things. I started thinking like maybe the glass might even be half full because of my experience of having all this bad stuff happening in my life. We have not been deprived, we have been freed. Shortly after going to Wisconsin, and shortly after getting started in the new job, and after spending some time with Jim G, about the same time, I met this incredible young girl named Kay, and she became the love of my life. I could start to make good decisions, not just bad decisions. I could start to pick good friends, maybe even good girls. And it became a part of my new freedom. I picked the right girl for me. At the end of 1977, we were married in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I really did marry a cheesehead. For any single people, put it in your consideration bank. They're great. And now we're all Packer fans, of course. Great time to be a Packer fan. Anyway, move on. I didn't have any of these thoughts last week, Kay, without you here, but because of the opportunity I had in Richmond, we came out and we started a business in 1977, which, interestingly enough, was the same exact year that Buddy Childress started Needle's Eye Ministries. I wonder if there's not a coincidence. Now that you know the atmosphere that I grew up in, my home was chaos, very confusing. My parents were divorced when I was 19. I essentially had no training on how to be a good man, a good husband, or a good father. I didn't know how to make a marriage work. So we had some problems in our early marriage. And as I found out, and after a series of divine coincidence, most of the problems were me. I didn't really know how to be the man that you need to be if you're going to be married and have a successful marriage. And through these coincidences, divine as they may be, I met a pastor who was trained counselor, unbelievable marriage counselor, and a wonderful, loving, and very wise Christian man. This pastor encouraged me to do something that seems a little odd now, but I know what his mission was. He encouraged me to read the Old Testament in the Bible. Now, as a Roman Catholic, I'd not really studied the Bible very much. I really knew a little bit about the New Testament, having taken some courses in high school, but I really didn't know much about the Old Testament. But he wanted me to pick on especially those parts that talked about the coming of someone that would set the world free, a Messiah, and it was all predicting the coming of Jesus. And I certainly knew that I had been very dysfunctional, came out of a bad background, and I was sinful, but, you know, I was kind of keeping it a secret from everybody. And then he, just weeks later, asked me to read the New Testament. And I'll never forget this little black book he gave me one time, and it had the book of John in it. And I was supposed to read it a couple times and then report back to him, so it was kind of like a little bit of a mission. And that took us across Christmas and into early January of 1978. On January 23, 1978, sometime around 9:45 to 10:17, something like that in there in the pastor's study, for some reason, due to some prayer that we had together, I just kind of put all these dots together. The higher power that I'd heard about in the recovery program really was a man, Jesus Christ. And it all came together for me. It was probably the most moving moment of my life. It was very Pentecostal for those that might get that. It was very charismatic. It was very exciting. The pastor led me into a prayer that changed my life forever. I walked out of that study that day, looking back now, as a completely different human being. And I mean completely different. I thought differently about things. I was so convinced that all of my sinful past could never have been forgiven by someone, so I carried a lot of crutches out of that room that day. I really did, over time, become to understand that what Jesus had done for me on the cross was the following. It was kind of like he jumped in front of the bus for me and then pushed me out of the way. Or if you don't like that, he jumped into the quicksand and pushed me to safety, but he went down. It was that type of friendship. And the more that I thought about those types of things, the more I realized that I would not be condemned forever, that he had given me an opportunity that would change my life forever. So how has this all impacted my life since that great moment in 1978? Looking back, it certainly did change my life. I walked out of that pastor's study altered, radically changed, and frankly, I immediately fell even more in love with Kay. It really started a new life for us. It was a gift that I didn't deserve, having a marriage with somebody like Kay. And I know now that God transformed my mind too. So now when I read the Bible, it just came alive for me. Every page just seemed like it was written directly to me. And that made my gratitude grow and grow and grow dramatically. When I read the words that Jesus said, and I went out and bought one of those red print Bibles, I was suggested to do that, and I would read just the words that Jesus had said. And when Jesus said that he was the way, the truth, and the life, for some reason, those words became the most important words of my entire life, and that scripture is next to my desk where this is. God spared my life and essentially gave me a new life at the same time. And I discovered that he wanted to use me right where I was. We kind of laugh about it now, but I can remember in the first year I thought maybe I was going to become a missionary or a full-time worker, and Kay straightened me out on that idea. Because she knew that she had married somebody that God called to be a businessman. He made me to also be a good husband and a dad and a grandfather, third one on the way, a board member, an employer, and a friend to many. He showed me through his word that he wanted me to live my life to be free and not enslaved, to be confident and not crippled and weak. He wanted me to be strong. He customized my life, so my life's different than yours, and he worked through me by working through the past that I had. When he changed my life, unfortunately, God did not give me amnesia about those first 26 or 27 years. It is hard when I remember the things and the way that I lived before coming to know Christ, knowing his unconditional love and the full pardon that he has given my life. He does not want me to live chained to the past with all that guilt and shame. He has truly freed me and separated me from the generations before me. See, the generations before me were people who were alcoholics, and they were addicts, and they were very violent people in some cases. They were people who lived very dishonest lives, and they were immoral and very dysfunctional. And he not only changed me, but he changed my family and my future family forever. Like St. Paul wrote in the book of Corinthians in his second letter, Paul says, I am happy to boast about my sinfulness and my weakness, because then I get to be a living demonstration of Christ's power instead of showing off my own power and abilities. I get a chance to look in a mirror every day and see what God can do. He can change a life. There's nothing more exciting to me as I see others that have their lives changed, because I know God is in the miracle-working business. He's in the business of giving people second chances and sometimes third and fourth and fifth chances. And he gave that all up to me. He can forgive any person of any sin at any time, and he can set them on a path to a new life. I know personally that he can set men free, and it's why he came to earth. No, I do not forget, and sometimes I even hurt when I have to remember my past. Yet Christ truly has freed me to know that with his strength, all things are possible. Whatever he asks me to do, whatever he asks me to do, whenever he asks me to do it, he gives me the strength to do that. He has truly not deprived me of anything. He has set me free. Merry Christmas. God bless you all.
There is no sin, there is no issue in life that God cannot set us free from and that Jesus cannot forgive us for. In the same book that David referred to as he began his walk with Jesus, the Gospel of John, there is this incredible promise. It is a promise for all time. It is a promise for all people who will respond. It is particularly a promise for today, the Christmas season. And it says this about Jesus: for as many as received him, for those who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. For those who would receive him, ask him into their lives, give back to him what he has given them, which is life. For those who received him, for those who believed, trusted, committed to his name, he gave the right to become a member of his family. At this time of year, I can think of no better message and no greater promise. My question to each of us today in this room is, have you acted upon that promise of Christ? Have you asked him into your life? Have you trusted in him so that he, from whatever you may have, can set you free? Please consider that question. There is no more important question in life. Would you bow with me in a closing prayer? And then I want to bring you back to the card that we ask you to begin to fill out. We'll finish that and we'll be on our way. Father, thank you so much for sending your Son to break into history so that for those who receive him into their lives and who trust in him for their future and for their forgiveness can have continual life and will be guaranteed eternity with you. Lord, what a promise that is, and what a time of year this is. And I pray for all of us in this room that that message we heard through David would continue to ring deeply in our hearts, and that whatever we need to do with you to be sure that that promise and that person of Christ is in place in our lives, that you would lead us to that point. We thank you for that. We thank you for this season. We thank you for your love and forgiveness, and we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.